It's Christmas Eve. The year is 1979. Soviet troops board several aircraft to prepare to be dropped into a foreign capital. Tank engines clank to life in preparation to cross the border. A plot to assassinate the leader of Afghanistan has been set in motion. In the coming months, Soviet forces will rampage across the landscape, engaging Afghan rebel forces and sustaining heavy casualties. But the Afghan people will not give up willingly. In the coming years, Soviet soldiers will be slaughtered by guerrilla forces, and the Kremlin will look incompetent to the rest of the world. The Soviet-Afghan War was one of the bloodiest conflicts the region had ever seen. But why the invasion occurred is just as jarring as how it ended. Soviet soldiers found themselves under constant threat. Rebel forces made their enemy work for every advance they made. By the end of the war, Soviet soldiers were begging to be brought home, and the objectives that the Kremlin hoped to accomplish were left unfinished. We're going to dive deep into what caused the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, and the reasons why it was such a disastrous decision. But before we go back in time to explore this fascinating and brutal period in history, we need to understand the motivating factors for why the Soviet Union did what it did. Reason 1. Afghanistan had always been of strategic significance. In the 1800s, Afghanistan became a key piece in what became known as the Great Game. We'll examine what this means later on, but for now, it's important to know that both Great Britain and Russia had been fighting over the territories in southern Asia for over a century before the Soviet Union even came to existence. Britain had spread its empire across the world and was worried that Tsarist Russia would encroach on its colonies in Central Asia. One of the largest concerns for Britain was that if Russia expanded into Afghanistan, it would bring them perilously close to British-controlled territory in Pakistan and India. As time went on, Afghanistan's significance never diminished. Whoever could control the region, or at least ally themselves with the Afghan government, would have a huge advantage in Central Asia. This is why when Afghanistan gained its independence from Great Britain in the Anglo-Afghan Treaty of 1919, Russia became the first country to form diplomatic relations with the new government. It was vital that the Soviet Union kept close ties with Afghanistan. The reason for this was that not only were its lands of strategic importance, but they also contained resources that the Soviet Union needed to grow. The USSR provided economic and military aid to Afghanistan in order to keep relations strong between the two governments. Once the Cold War began and the United States, along with other Western nations, started to spread their influence into Central Asia, particularly in Pakistan, the Soviet Union doubled down on its commitment to keep Afghanistan on its side at all costs. And one of these costs led to the invasion of the very country they pledged to support. Reason 2. Keeping a positive alliance with Afghanistan became increasingly difficult. If the Afghan government had bowed to the Soviets' demands and maintained close ties to the Kremlin, and only the Kremlin, the Soviet Union would likely not have invaded. However, that is not what happened. Due to several coups and instability in the Afghan leadership, the nation's future became uncertain. The Soviet Union was not going to risk allowing such an important country to fall into the hands of the West. Initially, it seemed like a coup in 1973 was going to bring Afghanistan closer to the Soviet Union, both ideologically and as an ally, but this was not the case. When Mohammad Daoud Khan overthrew his cousin and took power, he refused to become a puppet of the Soviet Union. He reached out to other nations for support and opened up Afghanistan's foreign policy to include some of the Soviet Union's most hated enemies. The Kremlin could not allow this to happen, so they did what Soviets did best. They incited their own coup to remove Khan from power. This became known as the Sour Revolution and left Daoud Khan and 18 of his family members dead. The Soviets helped install a regime loyal to the Kremlin, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Initially, this seemed to work, but those in power quickly began to fight with one another, and the new government fractured. The Soviets realized they were quickly losing control of the situation, and military intervention was needed. Conservative religious leaders from across the country condemned the new government as it was seen as an attack on their very culture. The Soviet-backed regime was eventually overthrown by a revolutionary by the name of Hafizullah Amin, who ushered in his own brutal rule. However, the Soviets knew they couldn't control Amin and that he would destabilize the whole region. They needed to intervene to maintain control of the situation. However, this time, more than just a coup was required. Instead, the Soviet Union prepared for an all-out invasion. Reason 3. The Cold War was in full swing. The Soviet Union kept a close eye on the unrest unfolding in Afghanistan. This was not because they cared for the current regime or the people of the country, but because if Afghan leaders started to look for outside help, they might run directly into the arms of the United States. When Hafizullah Amin seized power, he announced that one of his goals was to create a more balanced policy with foreign nations, which the Soviets believed was a less divisive way of saying he would seek better relations with the US. In short, it should come as no surprise then that the Soviet Union didn't want the US power and influence spreading in Central Asia, especially not to a country they shared a border with. It was unthinkable that Afghanistan would become closer to the United States, but it seemed as if the current regime had plans to do just that. To keep Afghanistan away from the Soviets' biggest enemy, drastic actions needed to be taken, which is one of the reasons the Kremlin decided to invade Afghanistan. Not everyone was convinced that the Afghan government would make a deal with the United States. However, according to the KGB, even if the US wasn't actively trying to ally itself with Afghanistan or undermine the relationship between the Soviet Union and the country, there was still cause for concern. Several intelligence reports suggested that Amin's harsh rule would destabilize the Afghan government, which the US could exploit at a later date when a new regime took over. Once again, the Soviets could not allow the US government to gain a foothold in Afghanistan, so the Kremlin started making plans for an invasion. Reason 4. The Brezhnev Doctrine. Very simply, the Brezhnev Doctrine states that any threat to socialist rule in the Soviet bloc was a threat to every other socialist government and justified intervention or war. Basically, this meant that any government that's either directly controlled by or has close relations with the Kremlin is protected by the Soviet Union, and theoretically every other communist country. You can kind of think of it like an unofficial alliance that the Soviet Union used to keep Western powers from interfering in countries that it had already meddled in and controlled. Therefore, the threat of Afghanistan, a country that the Soviet Union saw as a socialist nation, fell under this protection. However, by 1979, it seemed as if the Afghan government was falling apart and a different type of governance may be put in place. This was seen as a direct threat under the Brezhnev Doctrine, which permitted the Soviet Union to go to war in order to protect its interests. If Moscow didn't act, it might cause the US and other Western countries to question its commitment to maintaining its hold on certain parts of the world. This could not be allowed, so the Soviet Union prepared to intervene in Afghanistan. Reason 5. The threat of revolution within Soviet borders. The Soviet Union was absolutely massive at this time. This meant the population included numerous different ethnicities, not all of which were thrilled to be part of Soviet rule. No one was under the illusion that the regime in Moscow was trying to create the idealized form of communism where everyone was equal. Instead, the Soviet government centralized power and imposed an oppressive rule over anyone who willingly or unwillingly found themselves within their borders. Since its conception, the Soviet Union needed to deal with minor and major uprisings in its satellite states, as ethnic groups tried to secure their freedom and right to govern themselves. This was particularly true in Islamic states, where religious leaders were gaining power and shifting ideologies threatened the socialist regimes that the Soviet Union had put into place. Within Soviet borders, certain ethnicities were being rounded up and either deported or forced into labor camps. Moscow was concerned that if Afghanistan started to move away from its socialist form of government and began severing ties with the Soviet Union, it might signal to other Arab nations that they could do the same. This would not only pose a security risk for the Soviet Union, but also reduce its power and influence in the region. They couldn't let Afghanistan continue on its current path out of fear of what other ethnic groups might do. The territories of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan all shared a similar ethnic identity and religion with Afghanistan, which meant that if Afghanistan was no longer reliant on the Soviet Union, other territories might sever their ties with the Kremlin as well. But all of these reasons for why the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan aren't the whole story. In order to understand the exact motivations and why the Soviet-Afghan War went so badly for the Soviets, we need to go further back in time. Before both world wars, empires dominated the globe. It was during this time that the Great Game was afoot, and the foundation for future conflicts was set, including the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. During the 19th century, the Russian Empire was expanding. The British controlled a lot of territory around the world, but it was the land in Central Asia, particularly India, that they were the most worried about. The Russians were encroaching closer and closer to their territory. In 1885, Russian forces captured an oasis just south of the Oxus River from Afghan forces. At the time, Afghanistan was part of the British Empire, so this was tantamount to an act of war. But the British didn't really care for this territory in Afghanistan itself. They just wanted to maintain a buffer zone between the Russian Empire and their extremely important colonies in India. This incident led to an agreement of new borders by the Joint Anglo-Russian-Afghan Boundary Commission. In the coming decades, Britain would struggle to maintain control of Afghanistan. In 1919, when Amanullah Khan became ruler of the country and the Third Anglo-Afghan War came to an end, Britain finally conceded Afghanistan its independence and doubled down on protecting its Indian colonies by backing leaders in what would become Pakistan. However, once Afghanistan gained its sovereignty, Amanullah Khan knew he needed to maintain friendly foreign relations with at least one powerful nation to protect his country from external or internal threats. For this, Amanullah Khan reached out to Bolshevik-controlled Russia, who was more than happy to send foreign aid and military support in return for the new Afghan government helping them fight against Britain. Vladimir Lenin and Amanullah Khan finalized a treaty between the two nations in 1921. The following year, Russia and several surrounding territories officially became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and from then on, the Soviets would see Afghanistan as a vital ally in their fight against European colonialism and the spread of Western ideologies. Since Soviet aid had played such an integral role in the modernization of Afghanistan, the Kremlin had a lot of sway over the Afghan government. Moscow would interfere in the political process while ensuring the ruling regime understood they were indebted to the Soviet Union. The Soviets continued to send aid, economic assistance, and military assets to Afghanistan to ensure that relations remained in their favor. Before Tsarist Russia succumbed to the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union was formed, Russian forces closed in on the Pamir Mountains along the border of India. It was because of this that the British reached an agreement with the Afghan ruler at the time to sign an official border document demarcating the Durand Line as the boundary into what was then India but would become Pakistan. However, by 1947, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Afghanistan, Mohammed Daoud Khan, decided to reject the border, and the region became a point of contention. When Pakistan gained its own independence in 1947, disputes over the border continued. Around the same time, tensions between Afghanistan and Iran started to develop. The Soviet Union had invested so much time and effort into Afghanistan that it had no choice but to back them. Daoud Khan wanted to unite all the tribes in Afghanistan by giving them a common cause to fight for. He decided that taking the Pashtun regions from Pakistan was the best way to do this. So Daoud Khan asked the Soviets for more weapons and military aid to launch an invasion of the Pashtun region. The Soviets were happy to help as Pakistan had begun to ally itself with the United States as the Cold War was just kicking off. The Soviet Union saw the aggression by Afghanistan as a way to fight against Western encroachment, which was definitely something that they could get behind. The Soviet and Afghan governments became even closer and would continue to be united by the geopolitical changes that were happening in the region. It's important to understand this earlier history between the two nations in order to make sense of what the Soviet Union would do next. As the Cold War consumed the world, Afghanistan continued to become more and more important to the Soviets. It's this foundation that would later lead to the aggressive actions of the Soviet Union. When the Cold War started, Afghanistan remained neutral. Yes, it was more closely allied with the Soviet Union than the West, but there was no official alliance. When the United States began selling arms and military supplies to Pakistan in 1954, Afghanistan took the opportunity to try and buy its own U.S. weapons. However, when D.C. refused to sell to Afghanistan out of fear that they might use any military equipment against Pakistan, the Afghan government asked the Soviet Union for even more military assistance. The Kremlin was more than happy to sell them all the weapons they wanted. From 1960 to 1961, the military aid sent to Afghanistan was used to continue fighting for the annexation of the Pashtun region in Pakistan. In response to the aggressive actions of its neighbor, Pakistan blocked all trade routes through the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. This was devastating to the Afghan economy, which only pushed them closer to the Soviet Union. However, even with the increased Soviet support, the Afghanistan economy still suffered greatly, and as a result, its citizens became restless. Daoud Khan, whose sole mission was to unite Afghanistan through war with Pakistan, was forced out of office by the King of Afghanistan, Mohammad Zahir Shah. Once this was done, diplomatic talks between the two governments commenced, and an agreement was reached that reopened the trade routes along the border. Things were looking up for Afghanistan, which the Soviet Union wasn't entirely happy about. This was because the new prime minister wanted to improve relations with the West. 10 years after Daoud Khan had been removed from office, he retook control of the country with the help of Soviet-trained Afghan army officers. They stormed the palace and deposed the king without any violence. The Soviets clearly orchestrated this series of events, and everyone knew it. Afghanistan was too important to let a government that wanted to form ties with the West remain in power. Also, the Soviet Union needed Afghanistan to continue causing problems for Pakistan to to keep it from gaining too much power in the region and thereby threatening the Soviet Union's influence. They couldn't do this themselves, as Moscow didn't want to upset other Islamic countries that they had already had relations with. But not everyone in Afghanistan was happy with the regime change that restored Daud Khan to power. In 1975, militants from the Jamiat-e-Islami Party, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, attempted to overthrow the government. They were quickly dealt with by the Soviet-backed Afghan military and retreated to Pakistan, where the Pakistani government welcomed them. Later on, Massoud would return to Afghanistan to take up arms against the Soviets when they invaded the country. Even though the rebellion was unsuccessful, the Soviets were nervous about what this could mean. If more groups started to fight for their independence, revolutions could spread across their borders. With all the turmoil happening, President Daud Khan became worried about his regime being forced out and for his own life. He decided that it was probably best for his future if he could relieve tensions with Pakistan. During a visit to Pakistan in 1978, Daud Khan agreed to relinquish his support for anti-Pakistan militants and work toward a lasting peace between the two nations. This annoyed the Soviets to no end. They provided resources, weapons, and training in order for Daud Khan to regain control of the country, and now it seemed he was forgetting his place. The anger of the Soviets swelled when Daud initiated a plan to start reducing Afghanistan's reliance on the Soviet Union. This all came to a head when India completed their first nuclear test, called Smiling Buddha. Daud Khan ramped up military deployments along the Pakistan and Iranian border in case his enemies came knocking. However, in doing so, huge amounts of money and resources were funneled into the military, which caused the Afghan economy to go into decline. Therefore, what happened next isn't really surprising. In 1978, the Saur Revolution commenced and was led by Hafizullah Amin. The Soviets had very little interest in coming to Daud Khan's aid, as his shift in policy was not to their liking. Instead, the Soviet leadership sat back and watched Daud Khan be forced out of office as a new regime took over. By the end of the revolution, Nur Muhammad Taraki became chairman of the Revolutionary Council and chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. On September 5, 1978, the new Afghan government signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. It seemed to the Soviets that all was right in the world once again. After some restructuring, Nur Muhammad Taraki became prime ministership and general secretaryship of Afghanistan. Hafizullah Amin was a staunch socialist and believed that Taraki was not leading the country toward its full potential. During the Saur Revolution and his time in office, Amin had amassed a large following of dedicated soldiers who would do his bidding. On September 16, 1979, Hafizullah Amin deposed Nur Muhammad Taraki and had him executed. Some reports claim that the former prime minister was killed in his sleep when two guards under orders of Hafizullah Amin used a pillow to suffocate him. Amin named himself chairman of the Council of Ministers, chairman of the Revolutionary Council, and general secretary of the PDPA Central Committee. What this meant was that Hafizullah Amin was now head of the government, head of the state, and the supreme leader of the land. Throughout the political turmoil in Afghanistan over the previous few decades, the Soviet Union and KGB in particular had spies and informants throughout the Afghan government and the country. Moscow knew full well what was happening and was calculating exactly what they should do to ensure Afghanistan remained closely allied with them and them alone. That's why when Amin requested Soviet troops be sent to fight against the Mujahideen rebels, seemed like an easy ask. However, something else was going on behind the scenes of the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain. Based on intel provided by operatives, the KGB felt that Hafizullah Amin and his regime had destabilized the country. It was presented to the Kremlin that Amin's rule would cause harsh repressions and, as a result, the activation and consolidation of the opposition. This was not ideal for controlling and using Afghanistan for their own purposes. A Soviet Special Commission was formed to figure out the best course of action in Afghanistan. In April 1979, the council found that Amin was purging the government of anyone he saw as a threat, including those loyal to the Soviet Union. It was also reported that Amin was trying to solidify diplomatic relations with Pakistan and the People's Republic of China, which at this point in history was not on the best terms with the Soviet Union. However, what drove the nail into Hafizullah Amin's coffin was a report that he was meeting with the U.S. Foreign Service officer J. Bruce Amstutz. This was more than enough reason for the Kremlin to take action. In October of 1979, the KGB carried out a covert mission to gauge the reaction of the Afghan people if Soviet troops were to invade and occupy the country. It was determined that the Soviet troops would not be welcomed, likely leading to a prolonged war. But this report was ignored by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov. It was believed by many of the higher-ups that Soviet troops would meet little resistance and could operate in Afghanistan as needed. Therefore, between November 9th and the 12th of 1979, a Spetsnaz battalion of Soviet troops dressed as Afghan army soldiers secretly deployed to Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. The soldiers moved into position around the Tajbeg Palace, where Amin was reported to be moving his government. The final decision to eliminate Amin was based on the fact that the Soviet leadership believed his incompetence could lead to the current regime being overthrown by a non-Soviet friendly administration. The KGB believed that it was actually the United States that was sponsoring the Islamist insurgency in Afghanistan through their connections in Pakistan. If this was true, a revolution in Afghanistan could lead to a pro-Western government taking office. On top of that, if an extremist Islamic regime controlled Afghanistan, it would likely push other radical groups to seize power in parts of Central Asia that the Soviet Union controlled. All of this information confirmed to the Kremlin that a preemptive strike was needed to regain control of the situation in Afghanistan. However, it was the Soviets that were about to get much more than they bargained for. The plan was that with a short incursion into Afghanistan, Soviet troops could oust Amin and put the much more moderate Parchami communist Babrak Karmal in his place so that the status quo would swing back to their favor. Again, there were members of the Soviet intelligence community who warned that any Soviet forces in Afghanistan were likely going to be attacked by Islamic groups. And since the nation had yet to be completely unified by the central government, it would be like fighting several different insurgencies all at once. Even with these additional warnings, the Kremlin still believed that their plan to use Soviet troops to depose Hafizullah Amin would go smoothly, and the conflict would be over in a matter of weeks due to the fact that Amin's regime had overwhelmingly lost the support of the people. This was due to the brutal suppression tactics, unpopular reforms, and what was perceived as an anti-Islamic agenda that Amin's government was carrying out. On December 25, 1979, the Soviets launched their plan to remove Amin from power. Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev sent orders to the Afghan armed forces in Kabul that they were to carry out maintenance on their tanks and other military equipment. This would distract them while the undercover Soviet forces removed the current administration from power. At that same time, communications were cut between the capital and the rest of the country. Soviet transports flew over Kabul, dropping paratroopers into the city to join the disguised Soviet troops already stationed there. Hafizullah Amin had a feeling something was wrong and began taking precautions even before the Soviet incursion began. He ordered his top officials to meet at the Tajbeg Palace to prepare for any threats to his power. Amin believed that the palace would act as a secure location, unaware the Soviets already had troops in the area. Now the Soviets were just waiting for all their forces to get into position before launching their initial attack. On December 27, 1979, 700 Soviet troops disguised as Afghan soldiers were led by KGB and GRU Special Forces officers to take control of important government and media buildings, while the other troops secured military objectives around Kabul. Unknown to Amin, their primary target was the Tajbeg Palace, where he had unfortunately moved his entire base of operations. As dusk settled over the capital, the Soviet Zenith Group destroyed the main communications hub in Kabul. Amin could no longer call for help from his forces, even if he tried. At 1915, Soviet soldiers broke their cover and begun their attack on the Tajbeg Palace. Without the ability to call for military support, the Afghan guards quickly fell, and Soviet troops stormed the building. Before the night was over, the mission had been completed. The Soviets assassinated Hafizullah Amin and had control of the capital. The following morning, the Soviet military commander at Termez broadcasted a message over Radio Kabul that they had liberated Afghanistan from the oppressive rule of Amin. The Soviets cited the 1978 Treaty of Friendship as the reason for their intervention. The Soviets also told the Afghan people that Amin had been tried for his crimes and executed before the Afghan Revolutionary Central Committee. The actual circumstances around Amin's death are a little hazy. It's unclear if he was killed during the assault on the Tajbeg Palace or was arrested and quickly killed afterward. Either way, it didn't matter. Amin was dead, and the Soviets were now in control. The Afghan Revolutionary Central Committee, which was just a puppet regime directed by the Kremlin, installed former Deputy Prime Minister Babrak Karmal as the leader of the new government. At the same time that the Amin regime was being dealt with in Kabul, Soviet ground forces crossed the border and made their way south. And this was where things get a little murky. The Soviets obviously wanted more than just to get rid of Amin. Otherwise, there would have been no point in sending an invasion force across the border. The initial invasion was made up of around 1,800 tanks, 80,000 soldiers, and 2,000 armored fighting vehicles. In the coming weeks, 20,000 more soldiers would be deployed to Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was not just sending support for the new government that had been installed, they were waging all-out war against Afghanistan. It would be a decision that would cost them dearly. But at the time, it seemed that the Kremlin believed the massive invasion force was necessary to deal with any uprisings or rebellions that would occur. Obviously, when the invasion commenced, there was an outcry from the international community. Western powers painted it as the Soviet Union invading a defenseless country, and to be fair, most of the Afghan military was either trained by or equipped by the Soviet Union. One of the reasons that Afghanistan kept such close ties with the Soviet Union is that its military still needed to grow and was not nearly as strong as some of the other powers in the region. Therefore, the much larger Soviet Union would theoretically crush any resistance that the Afghans mounted. However, Afghanistan didn't get its name as the graveyard of empires by mistake, and the Soviets would soon find out why. When the first wave of Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, they ran into opposition from several different groups. The quick and easy victory the Kremlin had hoped for didn't come, as guerrilla ambushes and rural fighting bogged down the Soviet forces. For the most part, the Soviets were able to take major urban centers as their tanks and armored vehicles gave them the advantage. However, in Afghanistan's deserts, mountains, and caves, guerrilla fighters had the advantage. They used the landscape to negate Soviet numbers and caused massive amounts of casualties. The irony is the invasion by the Soviets actually caused their greatest fears to become a reality. The Kremlin was concerned Amin was creating a highly nationalistic nation, which is one of the reasons the Soviets wanted to overthrow him. However, when they invaded, it drove the Afghan people together in a united front to oppose a common enemy. This led to rebellions popping up around the nation. The government that the Soviets had put in power turned on them and accused their invasion of creating more unrest. General Secretary of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Babrak Karmal, demanded that the Soviets send more troops to help put a stop to the rebellions, but they already had their hands full. Instead of just dealing with any remnants of the former regime, the Soviet army found themselves fighting against uprisings across the nation. Tribal armies operating in rural areas and Afghan soldiers who had turned on them. Rather than being accepted by the Afghan people with open arms as a result of saving them from the harsh rule of the Amin regime, the country fought against the Soviets instead. This is exactly what multiple intelligence officers had told the leadership in the Kremlin would happen, but they didn't want to hear it. Not listening to or operating on false intelligence would appear to be a theme in Soviet and Russian invasions in the coming decades. Almost immediately after the invasion and throughout 1980, Soviet forces found themselves under constant threat in Kabul. Soldiers who were away from their units were murdered and left dead in the streets, sometimes in broad daylight. Members of the government were brutally assassinated to make a statement. By 1981, Soviet troops stopped patrolling Kabul due to the immense losses they suffered at the hand of Afghan rebels. Protesters took to the streets calling for the Soviets to leave and free their country. However, like so often happens when people without guns go up against a military force, the protesters get massacred. The killing of civilians only enraged the Afghan people more, and the Soviets were met with ever more resistance. The Soviet invasion did the one thing that every leader of the past several decades has tried to do, and failed. The people of Afghanistan were now more united than they had ever been before. This was only made possible because of the opposition that was mounting to fight against the Soviet invasion. For the next several years of the war, Soviet forces held most of the major cities in the country. However, this left about 80% of Afghanistan outside of government control. It was in these parts of Afghanistan that the Soviet Union couldn't compete with the guerrilla tactics being employed. After years of fighting, casualties mounted, and the Kremlin realized they had entered a war of attrition that they could not win. The original plan was to get the rebellions under control and hand over the reins of dealings with any further opposition to the Afghan government. But this never happened. The opposition just continued to get stronger and stronger. The Soviets were never in a position to pull troops out of the region because they were always under constant attack, and the government they installed would quickly be overthrown. When using brute force to try to squash the rebels didn't work, the Soviets tried to infiltrate the resistance groups and used their spies to gather information. It became clear there was no single army but a plethora of different forces that worked independently of one another with the same goal: push the Soviets out of their country. The Kremlin even tried bribing local tribes and guerrilla leaders, but they had no interest in surrendering or ordering their men to stand down. The Soviets then switched to search and destroy missions using Mi-24 helicopter gunships that would unleash a barrage of missiles and machine gun fire into the mountains to help support troops fighting in the rural landscape. Sometimes this would work, and the Soviets would capture villages and torture their inhabitants for information. But even this did very little to stop the guerrilla fighters from ambushing Soviet troops and using hit-and-run tactics to inflict massive casualties with few losses of their own. But the Soviet Union's problems didn't stop there. Rebel fighters started launching raids across the border into their own territory. Now the Soviets didn't just have to fight a war abroad, they had militants sabotaging their equipment and destroying factories within their own borders. 5 years after the invasion began, the Soviets found themselves no closer to victory and struggling to maintain any semblance of control. The Soviets decided it was time to get the hell out of Dodge. They started diplomatic talks with other nations to determine the best exit strategy. Even though the Kremlin knew that pushing the responsibility of quelling rebellions onto the Afghan army would fail miserably, they did it anyway. In 1985, unprepared Afghan forces took over while the Soviets provided artillery, air support, and other assistance. By 1986, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan armed forces numbered 302,000 men. The Soviets trained different divisions and branches to try to ensure that the government wouldn't be overthrown when they left. The Afghan leadership pleaded with the Soviets not to leave out of fear they would quickly lose control of the situation, as the Afghan people were clearly not on their side. In hindsight, it was no coincidence that the decision to withdraw came at the same time that Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1985. He had a different way of thinking about the foreign and domestic politics than his predecessors. Gorbachev wanted to focus on economic improvements, which couldn't be done while the Soviet Union was fighting a war of attrition in Afghanistan. So without any real plan, the Soviet troops were pulled out of combat starting in May 1988. The Kremlin negotiated a ceasefire to allow for the safe passage of their troops out of the country. This was done a second time in November 1989 to allow for the second and final wave of Soviet forces to return home. After all of their troops were finally back in the USSR and the DRA armed forces were tasked with keeping the government in power, things quickly fell apart. Less than 3 years later, in 1992, Mujahideen guerrilla forces moved into Kabul and took control of the government. For several years, Islamic extremists would be in control of the country, which would become a breeding ground for terrorist organizations like the Taliban. In 2001, the United States would launch its own invasion of Afghanistan and would run into the very same problems that the Soviet Union did. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan because of its strategic importance and to ensure that they could take control of the government. The last thing the Soviets wanted was a pro-Western administration taking hold in Afghanistan, but allowing an extremist regime to rise to power was almost just as bad. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, the invasion of Afghanistan led to all of their worst fears becoming a reality. The people of Afghanistan united to force the Soviets out. The war cost the lives of around 1 million civilians. Approximately 125,000 Afghan, Soviet, and rebel soldiers died as well. And in the end, an extremist regime still took over and the Soviet Union collapsed. Now watch what actually went wrong in Afghanistan, or check out real reason why the Soviet Union collapsed.